is Marina Bonanno, and I'm applying for a teaching position in 3rd grade. So here's how I would organize my literacy block. I'd have a read aloud for 10 minutes, then an intervention or enrichment, which is small group literacy stations. That would be 30 minutes long. Then we're going to do a reading mini lesson, which is skill or concept based. That's going to be 5 minutes. Cooperative or independent practice, so they're going to work on an assignment, worksheet, just practice some of those skills for about 15 minutes. Then they're going to have independent reading for 20 minutes. After that, we're going to have that transition into our writing block. So they're going to start out the writing block with word study, especially focusing on roots and affixes for 5 minutes. Then I would have my students do a writing mini lesson, which would also be based on a skill or concept. That would be 5 to 10 minutes based on the skill set and the concepts that they're learning and how long that would need to be. And then I'd have independent writing for about 25 minutes for students to practice. So my total literacy block for my students would be about 115 minutes. So some of the key concepts of my literacy block would be reading and collaborative opportunities. So that would be independent work, partners, small groups, and then whole group. Some of the word study components would be phonics, spelling, grammar, and vocabulary. And then in the writing, we do some whole group modeling, some small group conferring, independent writing practice, and then a lot of sharing opportunities, because I think those are super important for students to be able to share their work. So next I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I want to motivate and engage my students in the classroom. So some of the ways that I plan to motivate and engage would be through visuals, hands-on learning opportunities, movement, videos, and songs. So some examples of ways that I would incorporate some of these strategies into my classroom would be using Storyline Online, which is an online educational resource which provides read-aloud videos for students to watch. I know that sometimes, especially with virtual learning, that can be a really great resource, especially during those read-aloud opportunities in the classroom, which I plan to have 10 minutes every single day during my reading block. Another example would be creating anchor charts for students to use in the classroom. Students would be able to provide input for those anchor charts, and then they would be presented in our classroom. In a virtual setting, I would modify those, so I would scan those personally and then place them in a folder for all of my students to have access to. So if they're working on a worksheet independently, they would be able to look back at those anchor charts since they're not going to be in a physical classroom, and they'd be able to access that information. Another way that I really think is really important for students to learn would be through songs. So some of the ways that I would engage students in participating in song activities would be using vocabulary during our writing mini lessons. Vocabulary is another online resource, and they have really great educational videos for students. So they would be able to engage and listen to videos on like how to do the writing process and things like that, which I think they're really helpful, and it's a more fun way to engage students in learning different concepts. Lastly, I want to incorporate movement into the classroom, especially with the online virtual learning. It's really important that students are able to get up and move, because it's really hard for them to sit in front of a computer all day and have to learn that way. So one way that I would incorporate movement would be by having snap words every single week for students to practice, and we would slowly build a list of snap words throughout the year. So another way that I would do that would be having like whole group spelling games. Those would be a lot easier to do in person, so that would be something that I would incorporate probably more specifically for an in-person classroom, but those are just a couple of strategies I would use to motivate and engage. Obviously, through collaboration with my peers, I would also find other resources and other games that I could also include in my classroom. So one key feature of your literacy block in the elementary classroom would be your language and word study. That aspect is super important for children to make the foundational skills possible to continue on their education into higher grade levels. So it's super important that we add a lot of scaffolding in the language and word study aspect of our literacy block. So some ways that I would incorporate that need in my classroom would be through vocabulary words every week, which I would correspond to our prefix and suffixes that we are studying, such as pre, shun, geo, etc. We would also read and study different types of poetry. That's one way that's really good to engage students in word study. So I would introduce a different poem once a month or a different style of poem once a month. That way, during our writer's block, students would incorporate some of the skills and things that they learned from those poems and styles into their own writing. That way they can practice some of those skills, which is really important because if we want our students to develop those writing skills, they need to be able to have time to practice that. So it's really important as an educator that I allow my students to have the opportunity to look at critical anchor texts and mentor texts and then be able to practice some of the skills and things that they see in their own writing. Another way that I would engage my students in language and word study would be giving my students opportunities to use figurative language within their writing. So some ways that I could model figurative language would be through read-alouds, those poem opportunities, of course, and creative writing. So it's really important that students are allowed to express themselves and work on using those expressive forms of writing. So I would try to provide a lot of opportunities for my students not only to see those in action, but be able to practice those as well, because it's very important for them to develop those skill sets. So next I would like to talk about the 3 models of group instruction that I plan to incorporate in my classroom. So the first would be skill or ability-based reading groups. So the text is chosen by the teacher, and then the tasks are given to the students for independent learning. Next would be readers or writers workshops. So that begins with a mini lesson, which is followed by the gradual release model. So students will use that for both reading and writing. So that would be I do, we do, you do, and then do together, and then do independently. So students select the text, and then the teacher holds check-ins or reading conferences or skill-based groups during that time. And then lastly would be lit circles. I plan to incorporate those as well into my classroom. So those are framed by a topic or genre, and then the students choose the text that they want, and then teacher is like a facilitator or can even be a group member during a lit circle. So last, I'd like to finish off by talking about how I plan to differentiate my reading and writing blocks during my literacy teaching in the classroom. So one way that I would do that would be provide lots of scaffolding in my lesson plan. So I want to add a lot of supports for my students. I want them to have a lot of resources to pull off of when they're trying to learn the material and engage with it. So again, the ways that I would do that would be like having anchor charts, online resources. Another way that I would also help with differentiation in my classroom would be to utilize multiple senses in learning. So I talked about that earlier, but I want to use visuals, songs, movements, and then hands-on activities. I don't want my students to just be sitting at their desk all day or sitting in their room doing virtual learning. I want them to be able to get up and physically engage with the material when possible, whether that be vocally, movement, or doing a hands-on activity. I think that it's super important that our students are able to get up and move around in the classroom and be able to physically engage with the material whenever possible. Another way that I would differentiate for my students would be I would plan to collaborate frequently with other support staff members and be able to create lesson plans and add resources that they might think are really important for my students to use. I know that I can't always be an expert of every single student or every single situation, so it's really important that I'm able to confer with my staff members that I'm working with and other teachers and just think of what ideas that they might have or what resources have been working really well for them, because it's really important to be able to take advice and then apply whatever is useful into my own teaching. So I plan to be able to collaborate with them and able to get material from them, because I think it's really important that you build those relationships with other staff members and you're able to collaborate as a team. And lastly, I want to communicate and collaborate frequently with my family members and guardians of my students. I think that it's really important to build that relationship from day one in the classroom. I think it's really important that if you're able to collaborate with them, you could provide resources for them to take home and practice. You can find ways to assist those students and build scaffolding. And it's always really important that you're able to get advice from these parents or guardians because sometimes they have a different perspective, and it's really important to take on other people's perspectives when you're engaging and working with students.